Okay, so when you think about like the U.S. Navy, what comes to mind? I, I mean, for me, I always imagine these like incredible ships, like just these really advanced pieces of technology patrolling all over the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to think about them that way, in their modern form, but
It's easy to forget that they had to start somewhere.
yeah, exactly. Everything has to have a beginning, and, the Navy is no exception. And the U.S. Navy's story is, it's full of these unexpected twists and turns, and it's really quite fascinating.
So that's what we're going to be diving deep into for you today,
Yeah.
how the U.S. Navy got started.
And for this deep dive, we are going to be pulling from all sorts of interesting sources. We've got like firsthand accounts from the USS Constitution Museum.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and we've got the big picture, the overall narrative of both U.S. history and the Navy's place in that from Wikipedia.
Okay.
And we even looked at some things from the U.S. Naval Academy store.
Interesting.
So, a really nice variety of sources.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So what's the mission for today's deep dive? Like, what are we trying to unpack?
Well, what we're really looking at is the core events that led to the formation of the Navy, the forces driving it, the motivations behind its creation, and the significant roadblocks that they had to overcome.
And I'm guessing there were a few of those.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It wasn't some kind of like straight shot to, global naval dominance.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting journey. And what we want to do is trace that timeline from those very first inklings, back during the Revolutionary War, all the way through to when they actually established a permanent U.S. fleet.
Right. So before we even had a Navy, where did those first, ideas for an American naval force actually come from?
Well, it's interesting to consider that the need for some kind of a navy emerged pretty early on in the American Revolution.
Oh, really?
Yeah, even before independence was like formally declared, the colonies already had, a pretty strong connection to the sea.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They had seafaring traditions, and they even had state-level naval militias that were already operating, independently.
Oh, wow. So it's not like they were just starting from scratch.
Right, exactly. They had some experience to draw on.
Okay.
And as those tensions with Great Britain really started to heat up, figures like John Adams began to advocate for a continental navy.
Yeah.
Adams was pretty clear on his reasoning.
Hmm.
He said they needed a way to protect their coastlines from British naval power.
That makes sense.
And really importantly, they needed to be able to engage in foreign diplomacy. They needed to be able to secure that crucial support for their cause.
Right. So you can't really call yourself independent if your arbors are at the mercy of another country's warships.
Exactly.
Now, I remember reading that there was some pushback to the idea of a national navy at that point, like early on.
Right.
Why was that?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because creating a continental navy was like a real statement, I mean, obviously they wanted independence, but some colonists weren't quite ready to like completely cut ties with Britain. So forming a national navy was seen as like this big step, like really committing to sovereignty and independence. And that was a pretty big political decision for the Continental Congress to grapple with.
So it wasn't just a practical matter of building ships. It was about sending a message.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how do they actually go from this idea of a navy to like, actually doing something about it?
So it's interesting because even though there was this hesitation at the congressional level, there were individuals who took initiative.
Oh, interesting.
And a key figure here is George Washington. As commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he actually went ahead and commissioned the schooner USS Hannah.
Okay.
And get this, he tasked it with intercepting British merchant ships. So he essentially started naval activity on his own, and then he reported these captures to Congress.
Wow. He just took charge.
Yeah, it really highlights his leadership.
And that must have made an impact.
It did. It showed Congress how important it was to have some kind of naval defense, and this likely spurred them to take more formal action. And on October 13th, 1775, they authorized the purchase of 2 armed vessels.
Okay.
With the specific purpose of intercepting those British merchant ships. So this date, October 13th, is considered like the official birthday of the U.S. Navy, or as it was called then, the Continental Navy.
Wow, so 2 purchased vessels mainly focused on disrupting trade. That's a pretty humble start.
Yeah, it really is. And the Continental Navy's story is one of both success and setbacks. They did capture a good number of British merchant ships, which definitely hurt British trade, but they also took a lot of losses.
Okay.
At one point, their fleet was down to just 2 ships out of all the vessels they had. They lost a total of 24 of their own.
Wow, that's a big price to pay.
It is. But even with all of that, there are moments that really define the spirit of the Continental Navy.
Like,
Well, the name John Paul Jones immediately comes to mind.
for sure.
He's a legend from this era. During the capture of the Royal Navy frigate Serapis in 1779, his own ship, the Bonhomme Richard, was badly damaged. And when the British captain asked him if he was ready to surrender,
Oh, I bet this is good.
Jones said, "I have not yet begun to fight."
Oh, wow.
Talk about defiance.
Yeah, that's a great story.
It really sums up those early struggles and the sheer determination of the Continental Navy.
That's awesome. Okay, so they had that fighting spirit, but they weren't alone in challenging British sea power, right? They got some help from France.
That's a really important point. The naval support from France was absolutely essential to the American cause. In particular, Vice Admiral François Comte de Grasse and his French fleet played a decisive role. In 1781, during the Battle of the Virginia Capes, his fleet gained control of the Chesapeake Bay,
Oh, lovely.
which meant that the British couldn't reinforce or evacuate their troops at Yorktown. This was a direct factor in the American victory there.
So a French naval blockade basically trapped the British and helped win that battle.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting how that detail sometimes gets overshadowed when you talk about the revolution.
It does, and it really highlights the impact naval power can have on land campaigns.
For sure. So then what happened after the war ended?
Well, this is where things get a little surprising. After the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783,
Okay.
ending the war officially, the Continental Navy was disbanded.
Wait, what? They got rid of it after all that?
Yeah, it seems crazy, right?
Yeah, why would they do that?
Well, the main reason was that the new nation was broke.
Okay, yeah, that's a problem.
They were facing serious financial challenges, and maintaining a navy is expensive.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So they sold off the remaining ships, and the Continental Navy just ceased to exist. So you can see, even in those early days, there was this tension between money problems and the need for long-term security, especially for a nation with a coastline.
Yeah, that's a tough balancing act.
Oh,
It feels like a huge step back after fighting so hard to gain independence.
it does. And this period after they disbanded the Navy is often called like a vulnerable interlude for the U.S.
Okay, I can see why.
Because, during the colonial era, American merchant ships had enjoyed the protection of the British Royal Navy.
Ah, okay, so they didn't really need their own navy back then.
Right. But now they were independent and didn't have a navy of their own.
Okay.
So the Continental Navy's gone, and the young nation is left facing this harsh reality of, unprotected trade.
So basically, open season on American ships.
Yeah, pretty much. And one of the big consequences of this was that they couldn't pay tribute to the Barbary States.
Oh boy, those guys.
Yeah, they were notorious pirates capturing ships and holding crews for ransom.
Yeah, not good.
And with no navy to protect American ships or the money to pay them off, the U.S. was a prime target.
I mean, that's got to be scary for those merchants and sailors.
Absolutely. And this is all happening around 1785.
So basically, American ships were getting attacked, their crews taken hostage, and the government couldn't do anything about it.
Exactly. They were powerless. The new Constitution, which was ratified in 1789, did give Congress the power to create a navy, recognizing that it was strategically important.
Good.
But during George Washington's first term as president, there wasn't much progress on actually rebuilding a navy. It was a slow process with a lot of debate.
Yeah, I guess you could say they were learning the hard way about what happens when you don't have a navy.
They really were. So what was it that finally pushed them to actually rebuild their defenses?
Yeah, what changed?
Well, things really shifted in the 1793 when the French Revolutionary Wars broke out.
All right.
This messed up a sort of truce that had existed between Portugal and Algiers. See, Portugal had been blockading the Strait of Gibraltar, which had kept the Barbary pirates mostly in the Mediterranean.
Oh, so like keeping them bottled up.
Exactly.
Huh.
But when that blockade was lifted, the pirates went out into the Atlantic and they wasted no time. They captured 11 American merchant ships
Whoa.
and took over 100 American sailors prisoner. This was a direct attack on American trade and citizens.
Yeah, I'll get their attention.
It did. Finally, the government was forced to act.
So what do they do?
Okay, so their response was the Naval Act of 1794. This act authorized the construction and manning of 6 frigates.
Right.
And this is a really big deal because it marks the official establishment of a permanent standing navy. That happened on March 27, 1794.
So this wasn't just a temporary fix for a war. This was a real commitment to having a navy.
Exactly. It was a long-term plan. So 6 frigates, obviously not on the same level as the British Royal Navy at the time.
Right. But it's a start.
Yeah, definitely a tangible step.
Mm-hmm.
And the first 3 of these frigates entered into service by October 1797. The United States, the USS Constellation, and of course the famous USS Constitution.
Old Ironsides.
Exactly.
So that's when that ship story begins. It wasn't part of the earlier Continental Navy.
Right, it came later.
Yeah.
And We really have to give credit to John Adams for his advocacy during this period.
Okay.
He was a huge supporter of building a strong Navy, and he's often called the father of the American Navy.
I can see why. He understood the importance of having a navy, especially for a country that depended on trade.
Absolutely. And they needed it because this new Navy was quickly put to the test.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they saw action in the undeclared quasi-war with France
Wow. Okay.
from 1798 to 1799. But an even bigger challenge came, you guessed it, from the Barbary states.
Oh, those guys again.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't quit.
Nope. They were a persistent problem. And on May 10, 1801, Tripoli declared war on the U.S. in a very symbolic way. They chopped down the American flag at the U.S. consulate.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, it was a dramatic way to start the First Barbary War.
So what happened during this war?
Well, there are a few key moments that stand out. One was the capture of the USS Philadelphia by the Tripolitans.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a big setback. But then the Americans pulled off this daring raid led by Stephen Decatur.
What did they do?
They snuck into the harbor and set the Philadelphia on fire so the pirates couldn't use it.
Wow.
It was a bold move, and it really boosted American morale.
That's an incredible story.
It is. And later in the war, U.S. Marines actually invaded Tripoli and captured the city of Derna. This was the first time the American flag flew over a foreign conquest. Yeah, and it was a key factor in forcing the rulers of the Barbary states to sign peace treaties in 1805.
I'm starting to understand that line in the Marines' hymn about the shores of Tripoli a little better now.
It definitely adds some context, right?
For sure. Okay, so they dealt with the pirates, at least for a while. What happened with the Navy after that?
Well, after the First Barbary War, they actually downsized the Navy again.
Really? Why would they do that?
Money problems again.
Oh, of course.
The thinking at the time was to build lots of smaller gunboats for coastal defense instead of having a fleet of big ships.
Okay.
But this strategy would prove to be pretty ineffective.
Yeah, I can see how that might backfire.
It did. It's a good example of, trying to save money but ending up with a solution that doesn't really meet your needs.
That's a lesson I think a lot of us have learned in our own lives.
For sure. So then, of course, came the War of 1812.
Which is a whole other story.
It is. And you know what? The U.S. Navy actually had some surprising early victories in that war.
Against the British.
Yep. Against the mighty Royal Navy.
No way.
Oh, yeah. In a few single-ship battles, American frigates actually captured 3 British frigates.
Oh, wow.
It was a real shock to the British and a huge morale boost for the Americans.
I bet. It must have felt like they were really proving themselves.
Absolutely. But of course, the British weren't just going to take that lying down.
I can imagine.
They sent more ships to the American coast and imposed a much tighter blockade on U.S. ports.
So things got tougher.
They did. And on June 1st, 1813, the American frigate USS Chesapeake,
Okay.
which was commanded by Captain James Lawrence, was captured by the British frigate HMS Shannon.
Uh-oh.
This happened off the coast of Boston Harbor, and during the battle, Captain Lawrence was mortally wounded.
Oh, no.
And as he lay dying, he famously said, "Don't give up the ship."
Wow.
It became this rallying cry, even though they lost.
So even in defeat, their spirit was strong.
Exactly. And that British blockade became a major problem.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be hard to operate with your ports blocked off.
It was, by 1814, a lot of the best American ships were trapped in their own ports, unable to do anything about the British incursions on land.
Oh, wow, so they're stuck.
Yeah.
Mm.
But there were some key American victories on the Great Lakes. The Battle of Lake Champlain and the Battle of Lake Erie.
Oh, right. I remember learning about those.
These victories were crucial. They stopped the British from advancing in the north and ultimately prevented them from gaining control over the Great Lakes in the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war.
So control of the waterways was super important.
Exactly. And even after the peace treaty was signed, there were still some naval battles going on.
Seriously.
Oh, yeah. Just 3 days after the Treaty of Ghent, the USS Constitution captured 2 more British ships, HMS Levant and Cyane.
So they weren't messing around.
Nope. And the very last naval action of the war happened almost 5 months after the treaty when the USS Peacock captured a British East India Company brig.
Wow, it's like the news of the peace treaty was slower than the ships themselves.
Right. It's almost like they were still settling scores even though the war was officially over.
I love it. Okay, so after all of that, did the U.S. finally get to have a stable Navy?
You'd think so, right. But unfortunately, the problems with the Barbary pirates started up again.
Oh, come on, seriously.
Yeah, they'd taken advantage of the War of 1812 to go back to their old ways, attacking American ships and sailors.
So frustrating.
It was. But this time, the U.S. decided that enough was enough. they weren't going to put up with it anymore.
So what do they do about it?
Well, in 1815, Congress authorized a much stronger naval force to deal with Algiers.
Okay, good.
This marked the beginning of the Second Barbary War. They sent two powerful squadrons commanded by commodores. Stephen Decatur, remember him?
Oh, yeah, the hero of the Philadelphia incident.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And William Bainbridge. And these squadrons included 74 gunships of the line.
Whoa, those are serious ships.
They were like the battleships of the time, the most powerful warships around. It showed that the U.S. Navy was getting serious.
Yeah, no messing around this time.
Exactly. And shortly after leaving Gibraltar, Decatur's squadron captured the Algerian flagship Mashuda. And then they captured the Algerian brig Estadio, too. By June 1815, the American squadrons had reached Algiers, and all this naval power led to a new peace treaty with the Dey of Algiers.
Oh, yeah.
The treaty said that the captured Americans would be released, there would be no more tributes paid to the pirates, and American trading rights in the region would be guaranteed.
So they finally put a stop to the Barbary pirates for good.
They did. It seems like those early conflicts, especially the Barbary Wars and the War of 1812, really drove home the need for a permanent navy.
Yeah, they definitely learned some tough lessons.
They did. And those experiences also showed them that they needed a better way to train their officers.
Okay.
You see, Congress had authorized the U.S. Military Academy at West Point back in 1802, but it took them almost 50 more years to create something similar for naval officers.
Wow, that's a long time.
It is. For a long time, aspiring midshipmen didn't have much formal training, and promotions were often based on who you knew, not what you knew.
Oh, so not really a meritocracy.
Not really, and the lack of good training became really obvious after the Summers Affair in 1842.
What was that?
It was a controversial incident where there was supposedly a mutiny on a naval training brig.
Oh, wow.
This event made it clear that they needed to change how they trained officers. So in 1845, the Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft, decided to do something about it.
Good for him.
He basically went around Congress and formed a council to set up a new standardized system for officer education.
Okay.
And he transformed Fort Severn at Annapolis into what would become the U.S. Naval Academy.
So that's how the modern Naval Academy got started.
It's pretty fascinating how all these pieces came together, building ships, fighting battles, finding strong leaders, and creating a system for training new officers.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle that slowly came together to form the U.S. Navy we know today.
Exactly. And when you look back at the origins of the Navy, you see this pattern. They recognize the need for a Navy during the Revolution, then they're vulnerable for a while, then they build up their forces again, often because of conflicts and lessons learned.
Yeah, it's almost like they had to keep relearning that same lesson.
It's true, and it's amazing to think about how much debate there was at first about whether having a Navy meant they were truly independent, and then how they disbanded the Navy almost right after winning the Revolution.
Right. And it's pretty remarkable that the early U.S. Navy actually managed to win some big battles against the Royal Navy, which was the top naval power in the world at the time.
Yeah. Those early challenges, those times when they were vulnerable, and those surprising victories all helped to shape the character of the Navy.
For sure. Those big decisions made by people like John Adams and George Washington, along with the courage and leadership of people like John Paul Jones and Stephen Decatur, they all played a crucial role in building the foundation for the powerful institution we see today.
They did. It's a legacy that continues to this day.
So thinking about everything we've talked about today about those early years of the U.S. Navy, I'm left wondering, how did those struggles, those victories, those close calls, how did all of that impact the identity of the Navy and its place in American history? Like, how did a young nation that was hesitant to even have a Navy end up realizing that maritime power was key to its survival, its growth, its position on the world stage?
That's a great question. It really makes you think about the complex origins of this powerful force.
It does. It gives you a whole new perspective on the U.S. Navy.
It really does.
All right, well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those great questions.
And we'll keep diving deep into the fascinating stories that shape our world.
We'll see you next time.